MTG Monster, your place for Commander games every Monday and Thursday. Goblin approved. Hey, let me get another sip of that generic goblin noise, would you?
Hey gang, and welcome back. Just so you know, you can use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, one word, at FlipsideGaming.com to get 10% off orders $10 or more. You can also use the promo code at Original Magic Art on everything except for paintings. And finally, you can use the code at mtg.multizone.ca to get 10% off of your orders of singles. Using the code will help you save some money and help out the channel at the same time. I hope everyone's having a great week so far, because we've got another game lined up for you. Today, Martin is playing his Queen Marchesa deck, Long May She Reign, and he keeps a Glacial Chasm, a Swamp, a Temple of Triumph, Phyrexian Arena, Concealed Courtyard, Mogis, and Skyline Despot. Nick is playing Azor the Amazing, keeping 2 plains, 2 islands, Blind Obedience, Command Tower, and Reliquary Tower. You might have heard of the Queen of Dragons. Well, this week Max is playing his Sliver Queen, Queen of the Gods, and keeps Child of Alara, Crufix, the Locust God, Progenitus, Overgrown Tomb, Blood Crypt, and Scattered Groves. And last but not least, the replicating Riku is being piloted by Jameson, and he keeps a Kadama's Reach, a Cultivate, a Brainstorm, a Mountain, Firelit Thicket, Stomping Ground, and Carplusian Forest. Martin wins the die roll and starts us off. Martin plays a Concealed Courtyard, which comes in untapped, and he passes to Nick. Nick plays a Command Tower, and he casts a Soul Ring. Max plays a tapped Croson Verge, passing to Jameson. Jameson plays a tapped Stomping Ground, and passes. Martin plays a tapped Temple of Triumph, scrying 1 as it enters, and leaves it on top. Nick plays an island, and he brings out Blind Obedience. He passes, and at the end of turn, Martin uses Enlightened Tutor to go and find an enchantment or artifact. Max draws, and plays a tapped Blood Crypt, passing. Jameson plays a Cavern of Soul, naming Wizard as it enters. He passes, and Martin settles on a Soul Ring on top, and we move to his turn. Martin plays a Swamp, and he casts Soul Ring, which he drew. It comes in tapped because of Blind Obedience, and he passes to Nick. At the end of turn, Nick cycles Drifting Meadow to draw a card. Nick has a fast turn, playing a Plains and passing. Max drops an Overgrown Tomb, taking 2 and having it come in untapped, and passes to Jameson. Jameson drops his Firelit Thicket, tapping out to cast a Cultivate. He goes to find some basics, and passes to Martin. Martin casts Phyrexian Arena in his main phase, and with the spell in the stack, Max cracks his Croson Verge to find some lands. Martin then passes to Nick. Nick draws for turn, and plays a Plains. We then see Azor hit the field, and all of Nick's opponents can't cast instants or sorceries during their next turn. He passes, while Max settles on finding a Hollowed Fountain and a Stomping Ground. Max plays a tap Scattered Groves, and then pays 4 to cast his Altered Perforos, passing to Jameson. Jameson plays a Mountain for turn, and with a handful of spells decides to cast Riku, who comes in tapped, and Jameson passes. Martin draws from the arena and loses 1 life, and then draws for turn. He follows Max's lead by casting his own god, this time Mogis, and passes to Nick. Nick takes 2 in his upkeep to the Mogis trigger, not wanting to sacrifice Azor. We then see a Reliquary Tower for Nick, and he heads to combat. He swings his commander at Martin, and pays into Azor's ability, which is basically a Sphinx's Revelation, putting 3 into the X. He gains 3 life, and draws 3 cards as it resolves. Martin then takes the damage, and passes. Max loses 2 in his upkeep to Mogis, and plays a Polluted Delta, cracking it and taking 1 to find a Steam Vents, and then taking 2 more to have it come in untapped. This lets him play his Locust God, who upon entering, triggers Perforos and deals 2 to Max's opponents. Jameson loses 2 on his upkeep to Mogis, and then plays an island for turn, and he casts Kadama's Reach. He uses Riku to copy the spell, and he finds 2 basics for the field and 2 for his hand. He then casts a Brainstorm, which he'll resolve after shuffling, and then discards and passes. Martin loses 1 to his arena to draw on his upkeep and draws for turn. He plays a Badlands and brings out Queen Marchesa, Long May She Reign, becoming the Monarch as she enters. He moves to his end step, drawing from the Monarch trigger, and passes to Nick. Nick loses 2 to the Mogis trigger, and draws and plays an island. he casts Dovin's Dismissal in his main phase to put Max's copy of the Locust God on top of Max's library. Nick then gets to go and search for a copy of Dovin, Architect of Law, which he reveals and puts to his hand, while Martin realizes he should have discarded down one card. Nick then plays a Martial Law and heads to combat, swinging his commander at Jameson for 6. Max draws and loses 2 to Mogus and recasts the Locust God. This has Perforos deal 2 to all of Max's opponents as the god enters, and Max then passes. Jameson loses 2 to Mogus' trigger and plays a Force for his land return. In a rare instance, Jameson actually swings with Riku during his combat step, dealing 3 to Martin and becoming the Monarch. In Jameson's second main phase, he casts Howl of the Horde with Raid active, meaning he'll get 2 copies of his next spell. Jameson then resolves a copy of Echo Storm, copying it with Riku, getting a copy of it because of the Commander Storm, and getting to make extra copies of it because of the Howl, which results in Jameson gaining 6 Soul Rings, which all come in tapped, and he passes, drawing at the end of his turn because of Monarch. Martin loses 1 to the arena, and gains a tapped Assassin token from the Queen Marchesa's trigger as he's no longer the Monarch. He plays an Exotic Orchard as his land for turn, and he moves to combat, hitting Jameson to get Monarch back. In Martin's second main phase, he casts Koshkin Falls and passes, drawing at the end of his turn because of the Monarch trigger. Nick loses his 2 life to the Mogus trigger, he detains the Locust God, and he plays a Plains. We then see an old version of Lavinia hit the field, which detains all non-land permanents that cost 4 or less. He then casts a Kami of the Law and moves to combat. Nick continues to spread the love, and this time hits Max for 6, passing. Max loses 2 in his upkeep to Mogus, and gains an insect token from drawing, and has Perforos deal 2 to all of his opponents. He plays a Wooded Foothills, and pays 1 of each colored for his Sliver Queen, dealing another 2 as his commander comes in to each of his opponents. Jameson loses 2 to Mogus, as has everyone pretty much at this point, and he draws for turn. He plays a foiled Hinterland Harbor, and he casts Preordained to help find some action. He scries 2, bottoming both cards, and draws a card. He then casts for only 6 mana, Sunbird's Invocation, one of my new favorite enchantments, and follows up with a Phyrexian Metamorph. The Sunbird trigger resolves before the Metamorph enters, and Jameson reveals his top 4. He decides to cast Stolen Goods, and chooses Max, who reveals an Nylea, which Jameson will cast after resolving the Metamorph. At this point, Mogus is active, and Jameson has his Metamorph become a copy of it as it enters. Nylea then hits the field, and he passes turn. Martin loses 2 to Mogus for the first time this game, and then 1 from his arena, and all of a sudden the clock is ticking for Martin as well. He taps his Assassin token to keep the Koshkin Falls around, and in his main phase, we see a Tarnished Citadel as Martin's land for turn. He then casts a Michiko Kondo, and then drops an Orzhov Signet, passing. He draws at the end of turn, and Nick also sacrifices the Kami to blow up Jameson's Invocation. Nick takes 4 in his upkeep to the double Mogus triggers, ouch, and then detains Mogus again with his Martial Law. Continuing to lock down the board, he then sends the Sliver Queen to jail with a prison term. Before the enchantment hits the field, Max cracks his fetch land to find a forest, losing 1. And he activates his Queen to make a Sliver token and deals 2 to all of his opponents. Max then has to sacrifice a permanent because of Martin's Michiko Kondo trigger, and he sacrifices the very token that did the damage. The spell then resolves, and Nick then casts Dovin, Architect of Law, and he upticks the Walker to draw a card and gain 2 life. Moving to combat, Lavinia hits Jameson for 4, and Nick passes turn. Max takes 4 in his upkeep as well, and he gains a Locust token as he draws for turn. It deals 2 to all of his opponents as it enters, and Max sacrifices it once more to the Michiko trigger. Max has a kind of solution for this board state though, and we see how Child of Alara hit the stack. It then enters, and deals 2 to all of Max's opponents, and with the Michiko trigger once more rearing its ugly head, Max sacrifices the child to the trigger, blowing up all non-land permanents. He then passes, putting the Locust God back to his hand at the end of turn. Jameson loses 2 in his upkeep to the Mogus triggers, and draws for turn. Jameson's turn is over quite quickly as he recasts his commander, Riku. Martin loses 2 to Jameson's Mogus, and draws for turn. He plays a Glacial Chasm as his land for turn, sacrificing the Temple of Triumph. We then see Near-Death Experience, which is a card I don't often see in EDH, and Martin loses 3 to cast the enchantment by tapping the Tarnished Citadel. Nick loses 4 in his upkeep to the multiple Mogis, and his turn is pretty quick as he recasts his commander, denying his opponents the ability to cast instants or sorceries again on their turn. Max also loses 4 in his upkeep, and casts his own Soul Ring, which pales to Jameson's 6. He then casts Crewfix, and passes. Jameson loses his 2 and draws for turn. He plays a Flooded Grove, but with his deck being based around spells, has very little action that he can cast from hand. He activates the Stolen Nylee's ability on Riku 3 times, pumping him by +6/+6 and giving him trample. He decides to swing Riku at max for 8. Martin takes no damage from Jameson's Mogus trigger, but does lose 2 life to the Glacial Chasm's cumulative upkeep cost before drawing for turn. He plays a mountain for his land for turn, and he casts a Magister of Worth in his main phase. Martin, Nick, and Max vote for Grace, while Jameson votes for Condemnation. Jameson loses, and in more than one way, as the table brings back all of their creatures, with Jameson dying to the Perforos trigger. Martin then passes, and at the end of turn, Nick sacrifices the Kami to blow up Near-Death Experience. Nick loses 2 in his upkeep to the Mogus trigger, who's done a ton of work this game. He then moves to combat, hitting Max with Azor to finish him off. And with the combat step ending, Nick then moves to cast Supreme Verdict. The board gets wiped, and Nick then casts a Righteous Aura before passing. Martin lets his Chasm go to the graveyard rather than pay life he doesn't have to it. He draws and plays an Urborg as his land for turn, and then plays an Archangel of Tights in his main phase. He passes, drawing from the Monarch trigger at the end of turn. Nick loses 2 in his upkeep and draws. He casts an Action Injunction in his main phase to detain the Archangel and draws from the spell. Nick then drops a Thran Dynamo and passes. Martin draws and casts Thalia Heretic Cathar in his main phase, which Nick counters with the Fall of the Gavel, countering the spell and gaining 5 life. And with nothing else, Martin passes. Nick loses 2 again in his upkeep and drops his Soul-Sworn Spirit in his main phase. He detains the Archangel for another turn, and Nick passes. At the end of turn, Martin casts Masako the Humorless. Martin plays a Temple of the False God as his land for turn, and uses a Palace Jailer to exile the spirit. Moving to combat, Masako hits Nick for 2, and Martin passes, drawing from the Monarch trigger at the end of turn. Nick loses another 2 and draws for turn. He recasts his commander in his main phase and passes. At the end of turn, Martin uses Mortify while he can to take out Azor. Martin plays a Bojuka Bog for turn and exiles Nick's graveyard. He then recasts his commander and swings his board at Nick. Nick pays 1 white and 2 life to prevent the 3 damage from Queen Marchesa, effectively saving himself 1 life. And with nothing else, Martin passes. Nick untaps, and with what he's got in hand, realizes he's got nothing and concedes the game to Martin. Game review time. So I think the game-winning card this time was probably Mogus. That card spent so much time on Martin's side of the battlefield with no real ways to deal with it. I know there are cards like Return to Dust or Unravel the Aether, but unfortunately the guys weren't able to find one. Between that and all the cards that Martin drew from Phyrexian Arena, and being the Monarch, I think put him far, far ahead. I really liked Nick's Detain deck, and having Azor as the flavorful commander was a knock out of the park for me. Some of the cards unfortunately are a little low impact, like an Action Injunction, which only does one thing and draws them a card. Azor's ability is also kind of complicated. You often want to tap out to forward your board state as opposed to just drawing cards. He was able to get away with it once in the game, but I found for the rest of the game he didn't really have access to the mana to do it reliably. Max's Sliver Queen God deck was a treat to see since so many of his cards have been altered or extended. I found his line of play involving Perforos, Child of Alara, and the Michiko trigger to be particularly spicy and a great way to deal with the board state. It seemed like Jameson unfortunately this game struggled the hardest with the Azor's ability, and unfortunately all he seemed to really do was ramp and then lose the ramp. It was a lot of fun to see how many Soul Rings he was able to make in one go, but unfortunately they were detained immediately after, so he never even got to use them. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/mtgmudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/mtgmudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.